So today's presentation is based around results from the Sustainable and Resilient Farming Systems Intensification Project, or SRFSI. And it's really been the platform for the program. It's been going since 2014 and even some activities before that, and has tested and promoted conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification techniques in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. So currently around or over 100,000 farmers are using these new techniques, and the project is working hard now to understand the experiences of those farmers and look at how further scaling might be achieved. So Dr. Brendan Brown is presenting today. He works with CIMMYT and he's currently the project leader of the SRFSI project. And he's leading the work on understanding both the process and impacts of scaling. Brendan has rich experience in understanding, I guess, adoption and extension across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And his keen interest is in translating agronomic interventions into real-world impact for rural communities. And I'm looking forward to hearing these latest results and see what the SRFSI project has been up to and how they can help inform future pathways. So just a couple of housekeeping rules. I did mention if everyone can just stay on mute during the presentation, that would be great. After the presentation, Kuhu Chatterjee, my colleague, will moderate a question session. So we should have about 20 minutes for that. If you want to ask a question, just put a summary of it, or just say you want to ask a question in the chat box and Kuhu will get to you. So now I'd like to pass over to Brendan to start the presentation. Thanks, Brendan.
Tamara, and thanks to the SDIP program for giving the opportunity to present to everybody. So it's quite exciting. We've got a lot of preliminary findings, a lot of work that we've been doing due to COVID, being locked indoors, that we'd like to present. Primarily from, as Tamara mentioned, the SRFSI project, but also some work that we've collaborated with CISA. So the two flagship Sustainable Intensification programs in South Asia. And I have changed the title a little bit to make it a little bit more, changing from looking back in what constraints to progressing in terms of looking forward. So hopefully that comes out as well. I think at the outset, just to acknowledge down the bottom, we have more than 25 partners that SurfC has worked with that have helped us get to where we are today and to get to that substantial number of farmers that have achieved something through this project as well. So thanks to all of those partners, many of who are on the call today as well. In terms of what we're going to look at today, so we're going to first look at the context. We often gloss over what sustainable intensification is. So just to take a quick look at that. Should we be promoting sustainable intensification? Where did we get to? And then what are the next steps? So hopefully starting out, contextualizing and taking us through to that core research question that we've been working on for the last little bit of the project. And I'm glad to say that this is trying to be more of an academic presentation rather than a project-oriented presentation. And a lot of these are preliminary, so I'm hoping that we do have some time at the end to discuss through some of those things as well. So when we talk about sustainable intensification, particularly for SRFSI, we're really talking about conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification. Often we talk about the very theoretical elements of conservation agriculture. What I'm trying to do today is frame it in a more tangible way around the technologies that we're actually looking at. So in SurfC, that comes in 4 packages. So the first package is our 4-wheel conservation agriculture, which is through the zero-till multi-crop planter. In terms of 2-wheel, we've got the power tiller operated seeder and the strip till machine. The distinction there, the 4-wheel tends to be more in West Bengal, in Bihar and in Nepal, whereas Bangladesh is more focused on the 2-wheel tractors. We have our self-propelled mechanical rice transplanter, and particularly in Malda, we have no propulsion, we have surface seeding. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about SurfC and conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification. However, sustainable intensification is more broad than just conservation agriculture, and it is important to note, and some of what we'll talk through today, is that it also spans from a laser land leveler up in A through to fertilizer equipment such as D, and then harvest equipment, which are down in the bottom right-hand side as well. And CISA very much takes a wider approach and looks at the whole chain of sustainable intensification there as well. So now we've got an overview of what sustainable intensification is. The question should come, should we be promoting it? So going back to our original research work on trying to justify if we should be promoting conservation agriculture, the overwhelming statistics say, yes, there's a whole wealth of information, and many people on the call have contributed to this data as well. We do have this across all of the sites, all of the nodes. However, it's very cumbersome to try and present that. So just an overall summary here that shows some of the benefits that come, particularly in rice maize, rice wheat, and rice lentil systems. And indeed, I'm not an agronomist, so if anybody has those very specific questions, Dr. Mahesh, based in Bangladesh, is the man to answer that, and his email is there. I can take some very basic questions, but I'm not so good when we get into the technicalities of those. So that's agronomically, yes, but what about socially? So coming back a little bit to the International Day of Rural Women, we know that conservation agriculture can change the labour dynamics within a system. Indeed, you're looking at cutting about a third of the labour required by using these machines. However, we also know that labour is gendered. And there's a lot of evidence in Africa that says that conservation agricultural systems can actually make women worse off despite overall time savings. It's something that we really wanted to look into to make sure that socially this was the right thing to be promoting. Of course, we don't want to promote women-unfriendly technologies. What we did is, in the first 5 weeks of planting, we narrowed in with paired household surveys that were periodic over those first weeks, where a lot of the weeding was needed to be done in the system. What we found, if you exclude Bangladesh, because essentially the herbicide use is the same there, in the other systems, we found both for male and female. So you can see there's 4 sets of male and female there, moving from Bangladesh maize through to India maize, India wheat, and Nepal wheat. You can see that both male and female are hugely reducing the amount of hours that are required for them to be personally weeding in the field. And it's not that labour is placed or moved from male to female or female to male. You can see that both genders are benefiting from the change in tillage system there. But more than that, it's not just about time savings. It has to be about what you do with that time as well. So using some photo voice methods, what we did was try to look at what happened with that extra time. And what we found was that whilst there is extra time, the outcomes of that were quite different. So on the top right-hand side, we have an example where the gender norms are maintained, but eased slightly. So saying that I don't have to spend as much time in the field, now I can cook, now I can get my kids to school, now I can help them study. So there's still a gender norm there, but it's reducing the burden, as opposed to your bottom right-hand side there, that actually said, I'm getting extra income, I'm paying for my kids' expenses, farming, it's not so difficult, but also I'm able to have a little bit more self-sufficiency. I'm not asking my husband for money as much now. So that then is starting to change some of the gender norms as well. So it's interesting to see that it can go both ways, but in our study set, there wasn't any negatives identified with that change in tillage system. So overwhelmingly, what we found was agronomically, yes, we should be promoting this, and socially, yes as well, which is great because we have been already promoting it. So of course that leads us to the question, where did we get to? How far have we got? And then where can we go to from here? So Tamara mentioned about 100,000 farmers taking conservation agriculture in the 2019 year. So this is basically how we got to those numbers. And we thank all the partners for helping us populate these adoption curves as well. So you can see the orange there is surface seeding. So the bulk of the uptake of CASI practices, when we showed before practices earlier on, is in surface seeding. Primarily in mulga as well, but elsewhere around West Bengal. And then we have some increasing numbers for the others as well. We're not sure what will happen in 2020. It'll be interesting to see the effects of COVID. It's something that we don't really know where that curve's going to go. We would still expect it to keep increasing. Indeed, the momentum is there now, but there is a question about what happens as well. The other thing, when you bring that across, it's also nearly 40,000 hectares in the 2019 season that was undercast as well. So it's a great achievement, and thank you to everybody who's contributed to that. When we look at technology-specific adoption curves, so what we're looking at here is the different crops by the different technologies. So I think there's about 22 or 23 there. Apologies if you can't see it on any small screens. It's a bit cumbersome to try and show all of this. The things to note here, the dotted lines are the surface seeding. So they're obviously the ones, as we saw in the previous graph, that have taken off. And particularly so for mustard is something that's really got a really steep adoption curve there. When we zoom in though, what we can see is that a lot of these technologies are starting to get close to what we would call an inflection point in the adoption curve, really where it can be self-sustained, where the numbers are sufficient that people are now knowing about it, moving ahead with it. That's the hope. That's really where projects want to go as they catalyze change. They're not going to be around forever. They really want to get those, the steepness of the adoption curve up such that then they can gracefully exit and leave it hopefully to itself with the local extension and information systems supporting that. So we can see that there are relatively steep adoption curves on some of these. Others, they're still pretty low. I mean, you can't win them all. And a lot of those are reflecting some of our work in Bangladesh that is in some localized areas where we still have some troubleshooting to go through as well. Of course, this is unrepresentative data. This is basically just what we can attribute to the SERFC project. So what we then need to do is try and look at some representative data sets as well, particularly because the EGP is such a big place, talking about hundreds of millions of farmers. So 100,000 farmers is great, but it's not a drop in the ocean on what's out there. So COVID was a major impediment to this, and we were due to collect data that we would have been able to look at representative data sets on adoption across the EGP. We weren't able to do that, but we were able to sneak in a collaborative study with CISA before COVID. What we also wanted to do was to get away from binary yes or no, adopter or non-adopter, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Instead, what we've used is this scaling status and strategy framework. So trying to get a bit more of a nuanced understanding around the dynamics of a population, who's sitting where. Is it that we have exposure gaps, for instance? Is it that people are interested, but they are just not able to take the step into use? Is there negative evaluation? How are people using it? Are people buying this machinery? And this framework is really built on some work that I'd previously done in Africa, but truth more for looking at mechanization. So a few adaptations there as well. This is what you get. So this is the output. So before you get too overwhelmed, there's a few things to draw your eyes to. So over on the left-hand side, that's your traditional binary adoption rate. So that's what you can consider your adoption rate. On the right-hand side, however, are those 8 categories that were in the framework previously. So a few things to note there, and a few things that we're now going to unpack as we move through the rest of this presentation. What we're looking at is particularly around information gaps. So this is where farmers are saying that they don't have enough information to evaluate the technology yet. So that's the yellow and the orange. And then on the other side, your greens, you're talking more about actual use. So what is that adoption rate actually compiled? So I should state that this is just for Nepal, and specifically just for the Nepal Terai. It does cover both east and west. So east being where SERFC is.
Brendan, you've dropped out. Hang on. Your audio is not working. No. No. Sorry, everyone.
Sorry. I think, Brendan, we lost you 4 or 5 slides ago.
Did you?
Yeah.
I could hear until just this one.
No?
Now you're now.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
You can hear me now?
Now that's better, yes.
Okay, I can't hear anybody now, so this is going to make question time interesting after. Let's see how we go.
That's much
Just
clearer.
means tomorrow won't be able to tell me when I'm out of time. So, I'm not sure how far back I need
So
to go,
Robin says,
but let's go on anyway.
slide 16, which is slide
I can see
16.
tomorrow talking.
Yeah, I think you can start from here.
Can I get a thumbs up if people can hear me?
Okay. Yeah, you can start from last
Okay.
slide. I could hear.
So, what can we do to create momentum? So a few disclaimers. As I said, we would have loved to have had this data across the EGP, but we don't because of COVID. But what I would like to do is present the Nepal data as a case study, and we can assume that India and Bangladesh are roughly similar. They're not going to be the same. There's going to be some diversity across, but for the sake of this presentation, humor me, and we'll play with the data and present some of the work that we've been doing. So the first one that you would have seen there was the information gap, the exposure gap that exists in Nepal. So particularly what we're looking at is unaware and unfamiliar farmers. So what we can see there, as we go from top to bottom, is actually the age of the innovation. So for the combine harvester, Busa reaper, and four-wheel seed drill, you're looking at about 30 years in Nepal that's been there. As you move towards the bottom, you're looking between 5 and 10 years for the fertilizer spreader, self-propelled reaper, and the two-wheel reaper. So there has been some substantial time there. Even so, we're finding that there are some substantial information gaps that exist in Nepal. When we look at those 9 technologies together, what we also see is that the majority of farmers remain unfamiliar with the majority of those 9 technologies. So 6, 7, 8, or 9, where they haven't passed exposure. So that does indicate that information is one, if not the major constraint. Now, in itself, that's not novel. I think everybody can admit the challenges in delivering information to hundreds of millions of farmers is something that's always going to be challenging. I think for me, the novelty of this is quantifying it, saying that even after several decades, we still have these information gaps, not just completely unaware of what a combine harvester is, but saying that I don't know enough about it yet so that I can evaluate if it's for me or not. So there is novelty in quantifying that. In terms of what can we do about it, I think the first thing to note is Nepal is, in particular, in a complicated extension environment because of the new constitution, the changes in how extension is delivered. But I do think that these these exposure gaps exist in all of the places that we work as well. Obviously, the generic thing that we have to state from the outset is upskilling of government extension. What has come through though is it's not just the technical side, it is the communication side that's needed. The other things that have come through our qualitative work that potentially we're more able to work through are that a lot of the time there's a focus on sensitization, about letting people know that a technology, a practice exists. However, what the feedback was that you can get somebody in the door and that's great, but how do you keep them in the house? There's not a lot of, or there's less information for troubleshooting, what to do once you're an adopter. So looking at creating materials that can be used in that sense as well. There's always going to be this question on how to reduce face-to-face extension, particularly as we said, hundreds of millions of farmers. There's still obviously a preference for that, but how do we move past that? And the other thing to think about, particularly in these communities, was that the buy-in just isn't there because it's seen as an outside thing. So trying to work with communities instead of bringing in a technology. Now, with due respect, SURFC is one of those projects that had a technology that it wanted to bring and then went about testing that, promoting that. So the other side of that is to try and be a little bit technology agnostic and work with the communities to build solutions for them. So I think that's something, as we talk about changes in extension systems, something that really does need to be considered. Now, 2 and 3, to look at them a little bit more, if you're not part of SURFC or if you're tangentially part of SURFC, we have started to try and address that. So we do have our sensitization videos up on surfc.cimmyt.org, but we've tried to focus more on the troubleshooting, what to do when you're using zero tillage as well. And we've also got them in a few different languages. So to try and provide the troubleshooting assistance that was requested of farmers as well. In terms of the third point, we collaborated with Sam Coggins, formerly of ASIA, to look at ICT extension. So trying to see, can we at least partially replace the need for face-to-face extension? Findings very preliminary at the moment, but yes, farmers are willing to use YouTube. They can trust that if they're practical enough, engaging enough. However, the flip side of that is that inclusion can be an issue for these sorts of things. So as we do move more into this ICT extension, we do need to look at how equitable, how inclusive that is. So that's one side of the story around information. However, there is much more to that. What happens to the farmers who have obtained sufficient information? This picture is sort of like trying to bring out, well, what the farmer beating away everybody and us saying, well, why don't you listen to us? Why aren't you doing what we tell you to do? So what we've found is that the blue area in this graph, so what we're seeing here is the percentage of farmers that use information. What do? Are they interested, which means they know about it, they haven't progressed, they want to do it? Have they said it's not for them, or have they progressed to use? So a lot of this blue area actually means that people are saying they want to do it, but they're not. This is a fairly complex mind map. So this is very preliminary. This was only added into the slide last night. But I think it's to say that it's not one thing that is limiting progression. There's a whole suite of different things that we need to consider. They're all interrelated. They're all quite complex. So I'm looking forward to progressing this a little bit more so that we can actually create some tangible scaling plans around how to take that sizable population, subpopulation in these areas and progressing them to use. We do have a few early things that we think are important. So the first one is around local support networks. That means not seeing technology as an outside, but building from inside, and then having information sources, having these local service providers within communities. And I'm happy to say that we're in discussions with ASIA at the moment to try and look at how we could try and operationalize something like that, to build these local hubs and networks and work with communities to create solutions for them that are technology agnostic. So it's something that is really important to look at, and we'll see where that goes. A couple of the other things to draw out. We've said labor constraint is a driver of zero tillage uptake. What we're finding from the community is that it's also a constraint in that if everybody's leaving, so are all the trustworthy machinery operators. So there's a lack of skills there to actually implement what we thought was pushing. So it's a bit of a circular argument there that we have to think about what is it that we can do there to make sure that the skilled operators are there as well. Information flows, again, there's so much uncertainty of information, so that targeted material that we talked about previously, we need to look at making sure that that information is there, it is available, and it is relevant as well. And I think the most important one that probably came through was around who should take risk. So a lot of these farmers saying, I'm a small farmer, I'm interested, you've got to prove it, but the big farmers have to be the ones that do it first because they can afford to fail. So even as projects come in and do small demonstrations on small farms, that wasn't really resonating as much as saying that if the big farmers are willing to do it, then I'm willing to do it as well. It's a bit of a trade-off there around how we've thought about how to create inclusive demonstrations as well. Then we have negative evaluation. So there's two ways to look at this. On the left-hand side, you have, similar to what we saw before, what happens when information is obtained. On the right-hand side, it's about use. What happens once people have taken and used it at least once? So a couple of things to pick out. If we look particularly at the 4-wheel seed drill, you're talking about a third of people who have enough information about zero-till dropping out, saying it's not for them. There's a relatively high negative evaluation rate that comes out. The same when you look at the types of use. If you go down to the 2-wheel seed drill or the laser land leveler, essentially saying 1 in 2 people that have used those machines have stopped using them. So there's some quite high disadoption rates that are coming out in the machinery that are being promoted as part of the Sustainable Intensification package in Nepal. So to quickly focus on some of the reasons that have come out, there is this huge trade-off. We know that accessibility is an issue. We know we need more machines, but we need to find ways to do that without creating project dependency. So it is this really big trade-off. In terms of the actual evaluations that farmers are making, something that's really come through is that the attribution of blame is often placed on the machine. When often when you look at what the machine is doing wrong, it's actually the operator that is most likely to blame in those situations. However, communities are hesitant to blame the individual. They'd rather blame the machine and get rid of the machine and say that machine is not very useful, rather than look at the human elements of how the machine is operating, how the machine is performing. So there's a little bit there around ensuring when we go into communities that they have the ability to analyze what the reasons are for poor performance as well. I think maize seed drop, it comes up again and again. I don't know if it's time to go back to the drawing board on some of our maize seed drills, but there is unresolved issues still with seed drop. Mainly the capture of maize seed that's not uniform in size is still problematic. So that's the negative side, but what about the positive side? What can we learn from the people who have taken the sustainable intensification technologies? So again, what we're looking at is this is just if you are currently using any of these machines. So that other blue shade there actually highlights where use is predicated on project support. So you can see with the seed drill and with 3 other technologies, we've said that the adoption rate is this much, but it's actually about half that to a quarter of that, because we don't know for those farmers who are supported if that's going to be sustained adoption or not. So it's something really to consider when we report adoption, to know, is this actually sustained adoption or is this artificial adoption that we don't know what will happen when that's cut off. Again, with ownership, the dark green to the right-hand side, we can't expect that most farmers in the EGP will buy machinery, but we do need those service providers. Just checking the time, I might need to skip through a little bit. We do have another mind map here. Again, preliminary findings only put in last night. A lot to take in. I'll share the slides if people want to have a look at that, but there might not be time to go through that now, except for a few key learnings from the adopters. So one thing is that respect and status really comes out as a driver for why somebody might continue with zero-till, despite often some of the complications that come with being an adopter of zero-till. And that does have some inclusiveness implications, because people who are seen to be adopting are also seen to be lead farmers. They seem to be getting increased exposure to experts, and there are some complications there when we talk about wider scaling and what motivates people to do zero-till. The other interesting thing, I think, is that it's not necessarily that somebody becomes a Cassie farmer. Most of the adopters that we talked to really wanted to maintain that flexibility. Indeed, they had to maintain the flexibility, be it the season, moisture, land access, if you can't get the tractor into your plot in particular. And that does start to question some of the assumptions that we have around conservation agriculture, and particularly zero-till, when we talk about compounding benefits, particularly to soil health and production. They're not really true in this situation. So it's something that we might need to reconsider when we talk about conservation agriculture in South Asia as well. Again, maize seed drop, always continuing to be a persistent issue. The last one that I wanted to talk about was service provision, because as I said, if we're using machines and we can't expect everybody to buy a machine, the intermediary is the service provider. And a lot of the theories of change that are used in mechanization are really focused on service provision as the mechanism to scale to the masses. What we found was we're often asking, why aren't you a ZT service provider? And it's not really as simple as that. It's actually a triangle. It's, what do you think about zero-till? What do you think about service provision? And then what do you think about zero-till service provision? And they're three quite distinct questions or thought processes that are going on with drill owners, with machinery owners. And just to bring this back again, when we talk about targeting for service providers, a couple key things come out. The first one is that there's this really strong connection with altruism for most of the successful service providers that we've seen in CISA and in SURFC. It's really about, are you willing to forego some profit in order to create change in your community? Most of the larger farmers, machinery owners, don't have that. So they're not necessarily going to end up as service providers. In fact, it's quite a small minority of machinery owners that are willing to forego that. And a lot of that does come back down in the bottom here around working with smallholder farmers, and particularly around working on credit recovery, and the radius of operation that you can actually maintain and expect to get repayment of credit services. So it's like, why don't you expand your business? You know, you own the drill, you could be making money. But a lot of this comes back to the idea that if they go outside of their immediate circle, their immediate communities, they can't get the credit payments back. And then they're foregoing a lot of time chasing money, being a debt collector and everything like that. So it is a really complex picture on how do you create service providers. Really comes back to the idea of targeting, making sure that we do have the right people that we're targeting, and also that subsidies alone that target machinery purchase aren't actually going to get what we want with the machinery utilization and service provision. So there's a disconnect between what we're trying to do and what we're getting. We do have a few more data sets that we're working on. Particularly, I would have loved on International Rural Women Day to talk about the first one, where we have some paired interviews between male and female household heads to talk about how they evaluate different technologies. So still working on that. We've got some more service provider data that we want to delve into with tractor owners that aren't service providers. How do we look at that leap? And we also are exploring a little bit more around the weed constraints. So we know that there's a change in that system. Are weeds actually a constraint to Cassie's system? So that's what we really want to get down with about 400 qualitative semi-structured interviews as well. So my final slide, as we come in, we know that sustainable intensification is building. We know that the population is huge and any change takes time. So we've made some baby steps. We can see in our adoption curves that we're starting to get somewhere. What are the steps that, as SURFC closes, what are the things that would ingrain that and keep it going without us necessarily there? Some things that we need to talk about, I think, as we return back to the local support networks, not just innovation platforms, but more tangible than that, particularly around having that ownership in communities and not around projects is really important. So we had some plans before COVID to try out a few things there. It's probably not going to happen, but potentially we might be able to look at that maybe in some follow-on work. As we said, the subsidy programs that focus on unit sales aren't going to get service providers. So we need to look, there's some schemes in Bihar in particular that look at subsidies on planting for farmers rather than subsidizing the purchase of drills to begin with. So trying to look at what we actually want and how we can actually get there. And I hope the third takeaway that we have is that breaking apart from binary adoption, but looking at how we can target different sections and subpopulations to create scaling strategies is something that is really powerful in order to create those scaling strategies. All right, I need to thank the partners. So we had our annual review and planning meeting on Zoom. So down there, lots of familiar faces. And there is the CIMMYT group as well, up the top. So the engine room, the ladies of CIMMYT are really the engine room of this analysis as well. So a big thank you to them as well. I had to put Akriti as a stick figure because despite her working for CIMMYT for 6 months, because of COVID, we haven't been able to take a group photo with all of us in there, which made me think just how long COVID's gone. That's all I had. I need to find out a way to hear everybody again. So I'm not going to hear questions while I work that out. My apologies, Kuku.
Thank you, Brendan. It's for a very interesting presentation and lots of thinking to do around adoption. Till Brendan is able to get his audio back, I would request you to type your questions in the chat box. And Brendan, once he gets his audio back, we can take questions directly from the person.
Can you hear me, Kuku?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I can hear people. Good.
So the question, I think KK has a question. KK, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. KK, you can unmute.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Brendan, I was thinking, what question I was telling is that, yes, and seed dropping is an issue, no doubt. Initially, it is very much responsible for disadoption or less interest, etc. But at the same time, the feedback, an easy process of feedback, it has come from the farmer that if we can arrange a sensor type arrangement in the machine itself, which will be telling us because why the seed dropping is uneven, because the clogging of the pipelines, the supplying line. So one of the fantastic suggestion came from the farmer is that if you have a sensor type of arrangement, which will be indicating the driver that something has happened in the seed dropping, so that can solve the problem, I think. And during our feedback survey, it has come. So can we not I'm not a technical expert on that, but this suggestion has come from the farmer. This is number one. And number two is that regarding the service providing, my personal view is that to bring people in the service providing business, we need to continue the demonstrative thing that regarding the CA, etc., and also the continuous encouragement or training arrangement like this. So this is all from me.
Thanks, KK. I think I only got half of your seed drop comments. My understanding from the interviews that we've done is that part of the problem is the tine, or where the pipe and the tine connect, that getting clogged, particularly if there's any movement backwards. But the larger problem is the lack of uniformity in maize seed, particularly in low quality maize seed. The capture mechanism in the seed box is not able to correctly capture and put down the pipe to seed as well. So there's a few different issues, and often it's not, it's actually, again, it's not necessarily the machine as much as the inputs that are being put into the machine. And you talk about seed systems or anything like that, then you're getting into a very complex space. Remembering SurfSeed doesn't have that long left either. And I'd also take you up on your service provision comment. I partially agree, but I also think what we're finding is that if you want drill use, then demonstrations, training, and all of those things, they'll help get the message out that the technology works. However, the trade-off is that that still doesn't encourage drill owners to necessarily provide services. Because of the complexities that we mentioned around credit, working on credit, your radius of operation, altruism, and foregoing some profit to create change, all of these things that we perhaps haven't focused as much on because we've been rightly focused on making sure that zero till and CASI is actually something we should be promoting. So there is a little bit more that comes into that service provision aspect.
Okay. Okay.
Brendan, will you take Jahangir's question? It's in the chat box. So Jahangir, will you like to speak? Jahangir?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Koho. Thank you, Brandon, for a very nice presentations with so many informations. Just one of my specific questions on the surface seedling adoption. I understand that it's coming from the farmers' interviews, but I see that you are presenting in the adoption curve is much better in the case of surface seedling if we compare to others. So just I was wondering that what are the regions, and then because in the adoption and other cases that you split it into several ways, like the agronomic, economic, and social side. So my second thing is that second question is that what are the economics behind that why surface seedling adoption seems much better if we compare to others. So these are my two questions. Thank you, Brandon.
Thanks for the question. I won't claim to be able to fully answer your question, but from what I understand, one of the simplest reasons or explanations for why surface seeding is going so well is that it doesn't require a machine. If you look at the others, you've got to find a service provider, somebody's got to have the drill, somebody's got to have the skills, everything like that. It's also, surface seeding is quite localized to specific areas. And because of that, once it comes into a community and people have seen that the benefit is there, it can be a little bit easier to spread. However, we do have some people on this call that know much more than me, particularly some of our colleagues from UBKV. And some of them are also much more technically minded on these things. So maybe I'll defer to Apurva if you would like to have a go at that, or defer to somebody else from UBKV.
Yeah, Brendan, you are totally correct. The main reasons for the wider adoption of the surface seeding is that it does not require any machines. And also, when the machines are being used, you know that lands are very short, actually, very undulating also. And in West Bengal, particularly, there is no use of the laser leveler. So when we are using the multi-crop planter or any type of planter, there is always a problem for seed dropping. Particularly, you mentioned the maize seed. That maize seeds, whenever we purchase maize seed from the reputed organizations like Syngenta, Bayers, and other companies, even their seeds are not uniform. So seed dropping is the problem little bit. Now the problem has been solved out, but the main reasons of the wider adoption is that it does not require any machine, and it will help, particularly when we are using the residues in more amount, we does not require any herbicides also. That is, a pre-sowing herbicide requirement is 0. That is one of the reasons that marginal farmers, they are adopting this surface seeding technology.
Thanks, Professor Apurva. And I think the other one Anjana has just typed to me on the side was that there's multiple crops that can be done with surface seeding. So black gram, mustard, lentil, all of the smaller seeds. So that's also increasing the spread of it because it is quite a versatile practice as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brandon. The next question, hand raised, was by A. Ganesh Kumar.
Hello, good morning. Ganesh Kumar from IGIDR in Mumbai. I had attended the earlier meeting long ago at the beginning of the time, interested in happening, and you gave a wonderful presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is in your sample farmers, is there any kind of a group of farmers, some kind of a farmer organization, maybe a cooperative, maybe some kind of informal grouping? The reason I'm asking is that it is very obvious that scale is an issue here for using the machine. Okay, it may not be sustainable or it may not be viable, financially viable for small farmers. So you are required to go for service providers and so on. But if there is a farmer organization, then a lot of these externalities can be internalized by the organization, and that may hasten the adoption. So in your sample, you come across any such grouping, which can help facilitate, so you can also have specialization within the organization, somebody good at operating the machine.
Great, thanks for the question. So it's important to note, as I did put a disclaimer on, that the data presented there is from Nepal, and cooperative ownership is a bit more limited in Nepal than it is, say, particularly in India. So it's something that, for instance, in our roadmaps project, which works specifically in Province 1 and Province 2 of Nepal, communal ownership, custom hire centers supported through government is something that's coming up more and more, as opposed to the individualized ownership, purchase, and operation of drills. This particular data set that I presented didn't capture that element of machine ownership. So it was specifically a farmer survey. So what you're seeing is just the individualized ownership.
Okay. Professor Ganesh Kumar, do you have any more questions? I think he's muted himself. He had another question, I think. Okay. Should we move on to the next? I can't see any questions, so somebody will have to jump in. Any further questions?
Is that good or bad, Kuhu, if there's no questions?
That means either they didn't understand or
Hey, Brandon, that's Eric here. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's yeah, very good synthesis, and I think you've covered as much as you could in the context that the data remain a bit more limited than you would have liked. So I am not sure with the number and the sampling you got, we can draw too much conclusions, but I think the list of issues anyway is very good. So thank you very much. And we can be in touch for more elaborate discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Did I see Sarita with the raised hand or no? She didn't have. Mainuddin?
No, that's a very good presentation. It's good to hear. No questions. Just a comment on the surface that Jahangir has asked, that is the surface seeding. I think surface seeding has been in practice for quite long in that region, particularly as a relay cropping or Utera practices or others. So that has a much longer history. So that is one of the reason also could be that it is being adopted quickly. And the other reason that Brendan has said already, that no cost involved, no machinery hiring, and Professor Apurva told that no pesticides. So there are a lot of other benefits related to it.
Thank you, Mainuddin.
Kuhu, I have actually one question. Can I go ahead?
Please do.
Brendan, when the people do surface seeding, are they broadcasting in a field that's been already harvested and cleared, or does it include the mustard relay cropping that was very common in the past in Bangladesh, of people walking the rice field about 2 weeks before harvest and broadcasting mustard, and then harvesting the rice about a week or two later, and then the mustard comes through. So do you have a sense of how much of what you measured is an old traditional practice that happens to be no-till, and how much is novel?
Sure, I'm actually not sure if it is technically a relay crop or not, so I'm going to defer back to Apurva. Apurva, it'd be good if you can touch on the history there, particularly in Malda, if that is a reflection of what's come from Xerxes or not as well.
Eric, you have rightly mentioned, even Mainuddin also mentioned that it is an age-old practice, but we have little bit modified it. Sometimes farmers usually practice the Utera crops, particularly the on standing rice crops. They broadcast their seeds, but even after harvest of the rice, they broadcast it. And our intervention is that we have used huge amount of residues after sowing the seeds, and we have standardized the package of practice, particularly the fertilizer applications. Okay, so we have very small things we have intervened. Previously there was it was a common practice, but somewhat it has disappeared. But when we have modified little bit, and we also modified that seed biopriming, particularly the lentil, mustard, and black gram. These three crops are widely being practiced through surface seeding by our intervening technology. This is my submission.
Yeah, okay. So that's interesting that it's not only in Bangladesh. I was not aware that this was done in other places. Thank you very much, Apurva.
I think, Eric, your question, it is done in Nepal as well.
Kuhu, can I also comment on this point? Hello to everybody, if you allow me.
Ashik, who's asking?
It's Maize from this side.
Please. I didn't see you.
Thank you very much. Actually, this is little bit what we are saying surface seeding. We cannot consider as a generalized surface seeding. It depends on situations and where we are and crops. So in low-lying areas, that's after harvest of crops, because soil, conditions and excess moisture didn't allow any machinery operations. So in that conditions, farmers go for surface seedings for particularly legume crops and oilseed crops. But in SDIP again, we improve the management practices under those conditions. And that's Dr. Pruva rightly said about fertilizer, residue mulch, and so on. So that's one thing. Another, that's those farmers want to be intensify and taking new crops. And this is also common practice in Bangladesh and in parts of some, West Bengal, that relay cropping under rice, standing rice. Which is mainly for not lentil, but more for oilseed crops, especially for mustard. And that can be, the farmers can take additional one crop, but that needs also improvement in management practices and all. So we cannot generalize. So where it's possible also, that's in surface setting, we can go for no-till where allowed situations and all. So that's depend on many situations and all. Thank you. I think that will be helpful to further strengthen the argument.
Yeah, thanks, Mahesh. Your hiding as Alison Lang was confused us. Right. Any more questions? Oh, we've got quite a lot of questions.
Maybe that's Alison. I use Alison, send me link, and that I use. So maybe that's it coming through.
You're showing as Alison Lang. Anyway. We can take one or two last questions and then wrap up. If anybody is interested.
Just one comment from, if Brendan observed during the surveys and all. Brendan, we are doing this practice and promoting CASI from last 5 years or 6 years. Do you think that we notice any during survey that there is any behavioral change and awareness change, and information, building and capacity to adopt CASI, or still they have kind of same reluctant and same mind as they were before?
It's an interesting question, Mahesh, because it's covering both sensitization and then what you do with that information as well. So if that process is changing, so I'm not sure I quite know how to answer it fully. I think obviously on the quantitative side of things that were presented, it's in Nepal. And as we said, that's a very complex informational environment at the moment, where information isn't really reaching farmers in a coherent way. In terms of how people are actioning, I think it's quite localized. If it's somebody in your immediate network is starting to use an experiment, then there can be that change. But I'm not sure if the project itself can attribute any influence on how information is being processed at this stage. Yeah.
There are two people who have raised their hands. I think, can you speak up? Biplab.
Hello. Good morning. Good morning, Pooh. This is Biplab from UBKV.
Hi, Biplab.
Brendan, can you hear me?
Yes, Biplab, please.
Yes. Maize, you must admit it that when we are talking about conservation-based sustainable intensification, particularly in EGP, even in Kuch Bihar, most of the service providers, they are using RTP, but they are not following the principles of conservation agriculture. Maybe in next couple of years, our main challenge is to shift them into means they are using rice transplanter, but this transplanter is being used under puddled transplanting. So
we have lost you, Biplab.
I can follow on. I think Biplab might have dropped out from that completely, but I think it's a really interesting point.
Hello.
Oh, he's back.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Is my point that at least these rice transplanter has to be focused more under unpuddled transplanting, following all the principles of conservation agriculture. Otherwise, if we use rice transplanter not following the conservation agricultural practices or principles, at least we will be deviating from our target. This is simple my submissions.
Thank you, Biplab. If only the world was so kind of linear and ideal.
But it's quite interesting, Biplab and Kuhu, I think, because often if you look at conservation agriculture in Africa, it's always so tightly packaged around the 3 principles. And if you only do 2 of the 3 or anything like that, it's almost a Bible that states that this is conservation agriculture and only this is conservation agriculture. And that hasn't necessarily transferred into conservation agriculture here in South Asia. And I think, at least my opinion is that that's a positive thing, because you can look at a transition between a conventional system and the ideal conservation agriculture system, starting with the machinery, the zero-till machinery or the reduced-till machinery, and build your way into that system over a period of time. Part of the reason I believe that the situation for conservation agriculture in Africa is so complex is because it's so interlinked and intertwined, you cannot break it apart. And that's really stifling to innovation when it's all or nothing. So I think it's actually a positive. I take on board definitely what you're saying, Biplab. But yeah, I do believe that there's opportunity now, as the euphemism that I used before was get people in the door and then work out how you keep them inside the house, rather than locking them inside and whacking them with a stick and say, this is conservation agriculture. I think the opportunity is actually, there's more there than what I saw in Africa.
Yes, Brendan, I admit, because this is the real challenge of the technology people, who has to act as a pivot in this transition.
Okay, thank you, Biplab. And Tamara, did you have a last few words? Because we are going to, I was thinking of wrapping it up.
Okay, I just wanted to make one additional point just on that last conversation. A recent paper that I think is ML-JAT, and Mahesh is one of the co-authors, actually does look at, does a meta-analysis of a lot of different studies of CA in South Asia, and shows that you can, in that context, you can adopt one of the principles and you still get benefits. Even, you get more benefits with with adopting the 3 principles, but you can still have benefits from the individual principles. So I think that's an interesting thing. It's not just, I guess it's not just an opinion then, Brendan, that does have some basis. So it's by ML-JAT and co-authors, and I think it's in Nature Sustainability, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you, Brendan, for that presentation. I think it's really interesting. I think it would be great to have, the same analysis, obviously, for the different locations we've worked, because obviously there'd be quite different patterns between the different places. And it'd be really interesting to follow up on some scaling, I guess, pathways that align with, or that build on those that analysis. So thank you for that. And I think it really highlights the kind of nuanced factors around, the decisions that people make in terms of using both to adopt conservation agriculture or change systems themselves, and also to become service providers. So thanks for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thanks a lot, Brendan. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Robin.
Yes.
See you later.
Bye, Rob.
Bye.